Emmanuel Macron didn't just make the case for European unity. His long speech at the Sorbonne spelled out the way to achieve it and a timeline. The 39-year-old president of France choosing the country's oldest institution of higher learning as the backdrop for his big pitch for a reinforced Eurozone, complete with its own budget, finance minister, and even parliament. There was much more in those calls for European unity, a bold call that will set the post-Brexit agenda, or a hasty case of youthful exuberance that will go down like a lead balloon east of the Rhine. Yes, Macron went against the advice of some advisors who questioned the timing, what with the dust still settling on Germany's general election. And when he picked the date, Angela Merkel's CDU was polling closer to 40% than the 33% she eventually got. It's the age-old question. Do her constituents want a more European Germany or a more German Europe? Her potential coalition partners are at loggerheads over where to take much-needed EU reform. So is Macron's dream of a turbocharged Paris-Berlin axis already dead in the water? Today in the France 24 debate, which Europe will it be? And joining us, Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, member of the French Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche, who represents Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Exactly.
The French abroad in those countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for being with us. Also, we'll be joined a little bit later on from Munich for the Liberal FDP party by Nadia Hirsch from Berlin. German Green Party blogger John Worth is with us. And here in the studio, Famke Krummuller, who's a political and urban planning consultant with Open Cities. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It's never the right moment to talk about Europe, quipped Macron at the outset of his speech in the main lecture hall of the Sorbonne, the French president, calling for common bodies on everything from fighting forest fires to the Eurozone budget.
The Eurozone area alone, with a strong and international currency, can offer Europe the framework to be a global economic power. So let's tackle this problem from the right angle. If the euro is to be the currency of all the states in the European Union, that is, when they fill the criteria for adoption, we can build without delay a strong, solid and effective Eurozone that will benefit all the countries who join it.
Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, you were there.
Yeah.
Long speech where he really went into detail. Things like common tax brackets by the year 2020, a new Franco-German pact by early next year, and then, integrated Franco-German business rules by 2024. Why did he spell everything out so specifically?
Well, I think it was necessary that France propose something again to Europe. It was a very long time that my country did not propose anything to Europe. We were trying to impose some ideas into the debate, but we didn't propose anything to the continent. And so I think what the president tried to do today, it was to outline a vision, not for the next year, not for the next 2 years, but for the next 10 years, or at least until 2024. So I think it was useful, it was necessary. We have seen many initiatives over the last years in Europe. It was a long time France did not propose anything, so somehow it just demonstrates that France is back in Europe.
Let's put it to the jury. Famke, what did you think of the speech?
Yeah, it was a speech that was definitely interesting in terms of timing from the German perspective, because Germany just had its elections 2 days ago and doesn't even know yet who will start coalition talks with, etc. And it was perceived as pushy, I would argue, from Berlin's perspective.
Pushy?
On that front, yes, because the dust, as you mentioned, hasn't even settled. And Macron made very direct calls upon Merkel and put very direct expectations expectations on her, expecting her to be bold and have a sense of history, for example. That's what he said. So he was very clear that he's expecting Germany to be at the table and bring something to this discussion.
Yeah, he said he said exactly that. The answer of the Chancellor won't be shyness or withdrawal, but boldness and a sense of history. Nadia Hirsch, your reactions to that?
Well, I think it's quite good that Macron came up with his vision today. So we have some topics where really France and Germany are quite close together. And so it depends right now on the European national governments, but also on the European Parliament to see and to find out where we can find things where we can go together and step by step. So I think it was a good basis where we can start a discussion, and there are some really important issues are inside.
So the start of a good basis to start a negotiation. And on this key issue of having a common Eurozone budget, a common Eurozone parliament, a common Eurozone finance minister, are you for or against?
This is one of the one part of this whole vision of Europe. I think we have to start, and that was something that our chairman of the Free Democratic Party of Germany also said crystal clear, Christian Lindner, that there are a lot of issues where we can go further, and we need also some harder work in the national states, for example, in the labor market. And then it could be the next step to discuss about an Eurozone budget or something like that. But before, we need some other steps.
Do you agree, John Worth, that about this? And do you think the timing was right for this speech?
I think this speech was rather premature from Macron today. Really, we don't actually know how German politics is going to look in the next couple of months. So I think Macron jumped the gun to a certain extent. It's also the case that Merkel cannot really decide all of this on her own, because she needs to rely on at least one, possibly two coalition partners to deliver any of this. There are some of Macron's proposals for the Eurozone which make a lot of people in Berlin rather nervous, not least the idea of a common Eurozone parliament or some kind of common budget for the Eurozone. A Eurozone finance minister is perhaps a little bit less controversial. So I think these were interesting ideas from Macron, but it's a long way to go until Germany and Merkel would be ready to accept them. And
this idea of common rules for companies and for when it comes to everything to do with doing business and bankruptcy law, do you see France and Germany basically, well, converging into a giant federal state almost, it sounds like?
I think it's overdoing it to perhaps call it kind of converging into a federal state. This is essentially two of the countries of the European Union which would most likely be collaborating together. I think there's also an aspect there on taxation policy where Macron is quite happy that the British are no longer in the European Union because they've been some of those blocking progress in these sorts of matters. So essentially, I think we have to be a little bit cautious, but I think on those sorts of issues about corporation taxes, about common efforts to deal with tax evasion, Macron might get actually a better hearing in Berlin than he would do on some of his proposals about the Eurozone.
He talked about tax harmonization again, Pierre-Alexandre Anglade. This idea that we'll have common tax brackets across the EU by the year 2020, is that just pie in the sky stuff, a dream?
Well, I don't know. It's maybe a bit early to say, but it should be an objective. Today, there are too many divergences in the European Union. The situation is not satisfactory. Sorry, it doesn't function as it should be. So there needs to be an initiative on that. I know, and we know that some countries want to go further on that, so that we need to harmonize socially, fiscally, because today we see some dumping.
But the three that you represent, where the French abroad are, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, they're accused of being too lax when it comes to corporate tax.
Well, you know, the relation between Emmanuel Macron and the three prime ministers of those three countries is extremely clear and extremely good. And if he's speaking about that today, I'm sure he has consulted with them, and he doesn't say it just to say it. Those three prime ministers are the three prime ministers he has seen the most since he has been elected. So if he proposed something today, I'm sure he has consulted it with them before.
Do you take John Worth's point that it was premature to make this speech today?
I don't think so. I think it would have been premature to do it before the election. I think it's the right timing to do it because once the coalition is made in Germany, it's impossible for us to come and propose something. So I think it was important for the French president to say something after this very important election in Europe, and I think it was the right moment.
He also mentioned at several points during the speech, Famke, the idea that this was the best way to counter nationalism, a more integrated Europe. Do you agree?
That's one way of viewing it. I think the challenge that European member states face these days is to show, especially to the youth in Europe, about which Macron was talking as well, what Europe is and what benefits Europe can bring and what part of their everyday life is actually coming from Europe. And that has been a huge problem over the past few years. And national leaders are actually partially responsible for that, because often what happens is that if something comes out of the EU that is good, then they take credit for it. And if it comes out of the EU and it's bad, then it was the EU and it was Brussels. And so this type of rhetoric, just to adapt that type of vision of Europe and explain to people how Europe actually functions and what comes out of Europe that is beneficial, that's part of the problem to a certain extent.
So the argument that and the criticism that's often leveled at the EU is that democracy doesn't work at the supranational level and that it's not democratic enough, the institutions aren't representative enough. What did you think on that score of the speech? Did it answer those questions when he talked, for instance, about what pan-European MPs to replace the ones that are leaving from the UK, about a Eurozone parliament?
It's always a yes and no answer. It's a very difficult question. I mean, you could counter that argument by saying that at the end of the day, the supranational institutions, that is the EU, represent nationally elected leaders or nationally elected parliaments. The Commission isn't democratic, of course, but that's the executive. It isn't in any national country. So it's always difficult, I would argue, to say, yes, it is democratic, or no, it shouldn't be more democratic.
Nadia Hirsch, this speech echoed the one that was given when it was the State of the EU speech by Jean-Claude Juncker, in that you really had a sense that Macron was saying, you're either in the Eurozone or you're not, and we're going to have a multi-speed Europe, and we're going forward, and those that are not in the Eurozone, well, you're going to be left behind. Do you agree that that's the way to go now at this point without Britain being in the EU?
Well, I think we always discuss about the Eurozone and how to develop the Eurozone. But I think the most important thing is how to develop the whole European Union, and especially to take the citizen on board. See, we had an election on Sunday, and we saw that a lot of people voted right-wing parties. So we see that we have to give answers to the questions of people. And that also means on the European level and in the different issues. So yes, the Eurozone and also the unemployment, for example, in the southern member states are quite important. But I think there are a lot of more issues like terrorism and all these things we have to answer. So yes, the Eurozone is an important issue, but we should focus on the other issues which are probably more important to people and where we can go forward and could also have a good result after the negotiations.
Yeah, he talked about in his speech, Emmanuel Macron, common, more intelligence sharing, a common European defense force, common policing, common border patrols. Again, is Europe the answer when it comes to immigration, which, as you say, was an issue in the general election in Germany?
Yeah, for example, like you said, there are... For example, the Liberals in the European Parliament were one of the group which really pushed a key where you can, I would say, have a common asylum system, where we have a common procedure. And that's something like Macron also suggested today, to have an institution looking on the on asylum seekers. And so I think there are a lot of things where we could go together. Also, the prosecution. For example, there should be more cooperation, probably in the future also one European prosecution. So yes, there are a lot of things, and I think these issues are especially important to people in France.
John Worth, do you agree that, well, the results of last Sunday's general election in Germany really put those issues of immigration, of refugee policy, of the fight against terror on an even plane, perhaps even above that of a Eurozone budget?
I think they were more important in the general election in Germany than the Eurozone budget issue was. But bear in mind, I find that reaction in Germany at the election on Sunday a little bit delayed. Europe has come to terms with its refugee issues to a large extent since 2015, and there has been reasonable collaboration, at least between France and Germany, on that issue. So essentially, I do understand why Macron sees migration and asylum issues as central and as important, and they need to be dealt with to a certain extent at European Union level. And on that issue, he can find common ground with Angela Merkel and with the German government. I think the problem is going to come when Macron's ideas come up against the views of the governments of Poland, Hungary, perhaps Italy even. There he may actually come up against much more opposition than he would do within Germany with regard to his issues to do with asylum and migration. As for issues at the kind of common European border police, those issues have been debated at European Union level already for a few years by now. The devil there is going to be in the detail. How do you organise that? How do you staff it? How do you finance it? And we didn't really get too many answers on that point from Macron today. So overall, I find this area is an issue that ultimately Macron perhaps has some, even despite the election result on Sunday in Germany, has more support in Berlin.
And John pointing out there that it's not just about Germany. And you, I know, Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, you've been reaching out to fellow lawmakers from other EU member states when it comes to increased European integration. Tell us a little bit how far you've gotten in your discussions.
No, but the situation is the following. Today, we see that Europeans want Europe, but they don't want this Europe. They want a reformed Europe. They want a Europe that will protect them from terrorism. They want a Europe that will protect them from the global warming. They want a Europe that will solve the migration crisis. They want a Europe that will solve unemployment. So we need and we want a reformed Europe. Today, in Europe, in the European Parliament, political groups are divided. And so we need to think how we're going to rethink those groups and the political life at the European level in the next year. So yes, there are new movements creating all over Europe. We need to rebuild Europe from the base, from the ground. It's not a top-down approach. We need a bottom-up approach that was missing over the past years in Europe. That's what we have been doing in France, and we'll be doing the same in Europe with the democratic conventions.
All right, we'll pick up on this point when we come back. We'll take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We have the push by Emmanuel Macron for a more integrated EU, a major speech that was given earlier at Paris's oldest institution of higher learning, the Sorbonne University, coming up against, well, the hard reality of horse trading across the Rhine after Germany's general election, whether they'll agree to a lot of his proposals. We're talking about it in the company of Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, member of the French Parliament, representing the French abroad in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Exactly. From
Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Also with us is Nadia Hirsch, can I say once and future member of the European Parliament?
Yeah, that's right.
You're going to be taking over that. You're going to be going back to Brussels very soon. Brussels and Strasbourg very soon. Member of the Liberal FDP party, which is in coalition talks with the Chancellor Angela Merkel. Also in coalition talks are the Greens. A member of that party is with us, John Worth. John Worth, who's a blogger. Welcome back from Berlin, and we welcome back Famke Krummuller of Open Cities Political and Urban Planning Consultants. Just before the break, Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, You were talking about how you don't want it to be top down, and that's why there was this big push. Isn't there a bit of an overlap, though? Rather than just reforming the institutions that are already there, do we really need a Eurozone parliament, for instance, that's different from the EU Parliament, which is already seen as sort of a weak institution?
Well, this is you say that. I will not consider the European Parliament as a weak institution. But the fact is
the
that
criticism leveled is that all the powers with the Commission.
Yeah, I mean the Constitution has the power to propose to have an initiative, but then it's up to the Parliament and the Council to decide.
Doesn't the Eurozone having its own parliament, wouldn't that just add a layer?
We can discuss what will be the format of this Eurozone Parliament. This is, I would say, technical. What we need today, and that what is important, is to say that we need to have a governance of the Eurozone, which does not exist and doesn't function today. So we need to have a proper budget with a finance minister responsible in front of a parliament. Will it be the European Parliament? Will it be a parliament of the Eurozone? This is up to the negotiation and to the technical level to decide it. But we need this political governance of the Eurozone because it doesn't function as it should be. Look at the situation today in Europe.
John Worth, you agree?
I'm rather sceptical about this idea of a Eurozone parliament. I don't think we need to duplicate the institutions. Also, someone who'd be very opposed to this idea is the Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, because he spoke out quite strongly just a fortnight ago against the idea of a multi-speed Europe. So that's directly contrary to what Macron has been saying today. So bear in mind the European Parliament itself, which ultimately does actually have real legislative power, it would want that role for itself and would quite strongly defend that, I think. The last thing I would imagine that Macron would want would be extra parliamentary bodies, extra people being employed in Brussels that would look like waste in the eyes of European taxpayers. So I think that would not be a good idea, the way that Macron is proposing to do that. I would personally advocate those powers should be with the European Parliament as it currently is.
All right, multi-speed Europe or not, more budgetary powers at the Eurozone level. Macron's proposals coming up against the hard reality of Sunday's results in Germany. Gone is that grand coalition, a center-right, center-left alliance that, well, almost seemed to mirror the makeup of the brand new party of Macron here in France. All the talk is of a so-called Jamaica coalition, green, yellow, and black, like the flag of the country. Where does it leave the lip service paid by Merkel to increased EU integration? A subdued Victor faced the press Monday. She promised no red lines, she said, when it comes to Europe.
We could use more Europe, but then there must be more competition and more jobs, more punching power to lead to a stronger Europe. And that's why catchwords alone aren't important, but what's behind them. I'm also in discussions with the French president.
Nadia Hirsch, your thoughts on what's the deal that you would like to strike with the German Chancellor when it comes to Europe and when it comes to who controls the purse strings?
Well, in general, we have the discussion about, you said, about the Jamaica coalition. Right now, the discussion will start, and I think the point is that the Free Democratic Party, the liberals in Germany, are really a pro-European party, as the Greens are, and in general also the Conservatives are. So I think there is the interest of Germany to have a good cooperation with France. So we absolutely we are happy with the suggestions of Macron to discuss. And so I think there are a lot of, or the most important thing is to hear what the citizens are, because it should be in Europe.
So wait, you're happy to discuss? Does that mean you could be amenable to a Eurozone budget?
you always come back to the Eurozone budget. It's not the only issue. So why start negotiations with the issue which will be most difficult? Start negotiations with things where you could agree and you could start and go on. I think if we start with the most important thing, you will lose, and that's not in the interest of Europe.
All right, Nadia, let me put the question differently then. Will the FDP be demanding that it gets the finance ministry in Germany?
Well, it could be one issue for sure, but the most important thing is that we have the negotiations right now to find out if it really could come to a coalition to Jamaica. So if we have the process after finding a really good way to go further, then after that we will discuss about ministries, positions and all these things. So what we have learned, because perhaps you know, we lost the last elections, so we are back in the German Bundestag right now. We learned we have to concentrate on the topics and then after that on the ministries and the positions.
John Worth, do you see the Greens doing business with the Liberals and being in a coalition government together?
I think those negotiations are going to be very hard, but it's not impossible to foresee how that could work. There is already in one German state, in Schleswig-Holstein in the north, a similar coalition of the Christian Democrats, Greens and Liberals. As Nadia Hirsch has just said, each party has to focus on the issues which are most important to it, the policy areas that are most important to it. And here I think that the Greens would have less of a problem with Macron's views of how to deal with the Eurozone than the Liberals and the Christian Democrats would. But the Greens in such a coalition would look more to focus on environmental issues, energy, Dieselgate, air pollution, things like that. And so that could be a way to make the coalition work, give the Greens some typical environmental issues, and the FDP can potentially focus on some economic matters. But bear in mind, the Greens are in favour potentially of increasing taxes, while the Liberals want to reduce taxes. So there's going to be some complicated negotiations that are going to be needed. We're not going to see a solution to this in Germany for a good few months yet.
All right. Back in July, Macron quoted by Le Monde as saying, "If Merkel allies with the Liberals, I'm dead." Famke Krummüller, what did he mean by that?
It's probably a bit extreme to view it that way. As we just heard, the Liberals in Germany, they are very pro-European. They have stricter views, let's say, than maybe what he's envisioning for the Eurozone.
They're fiscal hawks. They don't want to pay for the rest of the continent. Is that it?
Exactly, that's right. And we did see that when they were in government with the CDU during the beginning of the Greek crisis, which was often extremely difficult and heated debate in German Bundestag because the FDP was in parliament and in government. And that had changed with the Social Democrats in charge, and now will probably change back a little bit. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. I mean, to a certain extent, I would argue from Macron's perspective, or maybe from the perspective of reforming the future of Europe, the stars have somewhat aligned. It doesn't mean that it will be very easy, but we have...
Even with the Social Democrats out?
Yes, because if you look at the bigger pictures, we do have an extremely pro-European president in France. We have Brexit happening, which is pushing other member states towards cooperation and looking at the future together. And then we also have something that we haven't talked about yet, which is Merkel in her last term, because she most likely won't run again. So the question will be, how will she seek to shape her last term? Is she motivated to really do something with regards to the future of Europe? And yes, she'll have coalition partners that she will have to bring on board, but they will also, to a certain extent, be junior coalition partners. They have 10% in the parliament. And I think her personal ambition will matter as well, something that is not much talked about. How
much clout will she have, though, if she's weakened? And, I mean, this is the worst ever score by the CDU. Right. How much will she be able to throw her weight around and impose her, quote-unquote, legacy in her final term, if it is her final term?
It will depend much on other domestic issues, maybe, and how the coalition at the end of the day functions, and whether each party ultimately finds a way to push the most important issues for them.
Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, it's disturbing a little bit for you what I just heard from John Worth, which was that the Greens can do business with the Liberals, but they're not going to make a big fight out of the issue of of how much you mutualize the budget when it comes to the Eurozone, how far you go in multi-speed Europe on the financial side. It's not going to be their issue. So in other words, they're not going to fight the fight for Macron. And so does that mean, again, that this concept of a Eurozone budget is dead in the water?
I don't think so. It's premature to speak. The coalition is not formed yet. The talks haven't really started it. I see a lot of possibilities. You focus on the Eurozone budget, but this is not the only thing that we'll be speaking about in the next Europe. The speech of Macron today was 2.5 hours or 2 hours. So it was very broad, and it was about a defense union, about migration, about terrorism, about global warming, about intelligence, artificial intelligence, and stuff like that. It was a real vision for the future. So yes, indeed, there will be a difficult part of the talk, which will be the Eurozone budget, but this is not the only thing. And I'm sure, and I know, that in Germany, with people like Nadia Hirsch in the FDP and other people from the FDP and with the Greens as well, they are responsible people and who wants that Europe go forward. And so those people will be all together on the table, and I'm sure we can find an agreement at some point.
All right, Nadia Hirsch and you both saying that, of course, Europe is about much more than budgets and monetary policy. Now, the context in Germany is one where the AfD, which started as a dissident offshoot of the CDU, angered by the Greek bailout, has now morphed into an anti-Islam, anti-immigrant far-right party, one that's weighing on the tone, even within Merkel's own party.
Many voters have been driven to other parties because the Red Greens always call stricter immigration rules Nazi politics, or they call me Islamophobic just because I said that immigrants have a duty to be integrated.
John Worth, that's the deputy head of the CDU speaking. Again, the 13% of the AfD, how much is that going to weigh on Merkel's policies going forth? And what's your reaction to what we just heard?
I find Klöckner's position to be rather frustrating, although it's not uncommon within the Christian Democrats. Bear in mind that what's happened here is a reaction to all kinds of different things, of which migration and Germany's asylum and immigration policy is only one component part of that. Bear in mind that essentially this party, the Alternative für Deutschland, has been growing in Germany for a number of years already. It's not that they've come out of nowhere to suddenly get into the Bundestag. Also bear in mind that the places where they gained most of the support are the former eastern German states, which also are the areas which have the lowest percentage of people who were not born in Germany. So essentially this is also, this vote for the Alternative für Deutschland is born out of dissatisfaction, as well as it being born out of some concern about asylum and migration questions. So bear in mind that Merkel is going to hear those kind of voices within the Christian Democrats. But what can you actually do at the moment? Bear in mind that Germany's asylum policy is already much tighter today than it was 2 years ago. Merkel's already struck a deal with Turkey in order to reduce the numbers of people coming to Europe. So essentially, I do not see how the Christian Democrats can be a responsible party of government and tighten up those rules any further. And the Greens will be watching out for them to make sure that the asylum and immigration policy remains relatively humane. So it's going to be quite tense, I think, but I think we shouldn't overestimate the danger that is posed by the Alternative für Deutschland. They're going to be difficult, but we shouldn't exaggerate their influence.
Nadia Hirsch, you're sitting in Munich. In Bavaria, the AfD got 12% of the vote. Do you agree with John that we shouldn't overestimate their relative weight?
Well, in general, it's a signal. I think policymakers really have to think about like Merkel said yesterday, we have to listen to people and to find solutions to their answers. That's not a specific issue on migration. We had also discussions about unemployment, about education issues. There are a lot of things of the daily business people are not really happy with. So I think in general, it's a question, how do we make a policy, how we could participate, or what ways of participation could we give to citizens? So that's a general issue. But in Bavaria, for example, like you said, we had the highest rates, percentages in the Western member states of Germany. So we should be aware that the CSU tried to focus on that issue of migration, with sometimes are not really good wording. So I think we should really have to show where the borders, where the lines, the red lines. So yes, we are looking for answers, but we also have to make crystal clear that it is not possible to have a discussion about migration in that way, like the AfD did in the campaign.
Famke, getting back to your point about how this is Angela Merkel's legacy tenure now, her fourth term, that with the AfD there in the opposition, it's going to change the way Germany approaches Europe?
I think the real tension that she will face will come from within her party, and what will remain to be seen over the next few years is how, especially the Bavarian sister party, the CSU, wants to play this game, let's say, of using the migration crisis, and the problem that she could face there over the next year is that there are local elections in Bavaria in a year, and so the CSU is under pressure from that perspective. Maybe after that, tensions will calm a little bit, and also the acuteness of the migration crisis in Germany will go away, and the AfD will have less populist.
We're always waiting on an election, aren't we, in Germany? We're waiting on a local regional election in Saxony, I believe, before we know what the coalition really looks like. Right. You're saying that the elections next year in Bavaria matter. It's always election time in Germany.
Of course, federal state.
All right. Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, what are the lessons you've drawn from Sunday's results in Germany?
Well, I would say that we see a collapse of the two major movements, the CDU and the SPD. We see at the same time, of course, the rise of the AfD, which is a signal that we should not neglect, because this is something new for Germany. It did not happen since the Second World War, so it says something about the political situation in the country. It says something about the political situation in Europe, and I think that we need to listen to that, and we need to respond to that. And I think that one of the messages that I would take from this result of the AfD is that the people, at least part of the people, are not fully satisfied with the functioning of the European Union today. Many people who voted for the AfD on Sunday did it partly, for some of them, because of the way Mrs. Merkel and the CDU handled the migration crisis. This is one of the reasons. And the way Mrs. Merkel handled this crisis, it was, I think she did it very well, because no one else in Europe wanted to do it. But she had to do it because the European Union was not functioning properly, and that the European Union was not able to answer this crisis that we were facing. So in the end, Merkel had to do this move, and then now we see the rise of the AfD. So it should interrogate us on how our union is functioning, especially on the managing of the borders.
John Worth, we're used to politics being polarized here in France. Do you get the sense that Germany is more polarized after Sunday's result than it was before?
I'm not sure polarization would be the word I would use. I think that it's perhaps the views are more spread, are more split. The kind of two-party politics of Germany, the consensus which has held for so long, has to a certain extent broken. But bear in mind, still at the end, 87% of the votes that went to parties in the Bundestag were for relatively moderate parties. It just makes German coalition building a lot harder now with 6 parties in the Bundestag. But bear in mind, ultimately, and the fact we're even talking about this so-called Jamaica coalition shows there's still this enduring collaborative nature of German politics. As Femke also said, Germany being a federal state means it's not only the government in Berlin that decides everything. So it's noticeably harder, but it's definitely not two camps. There are multiple views, differences of view even within parties as well as between them. That makes for a complicated picture, definitely not a kind of a bipartisan picture by any means.
All right, a final point on this because we're out of time. Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, when you hear the way in Germany, first they discuss the platform, then they discuss the cabinet, the way that you have the regional elections that really matter. Do you wish that France was a little more like Germany in that respect, in terms of its institutions?
I won't comment on that. I mean, every country has its own political problem. We've got ours, you've got yours. Now, good luck. I wish that you will have a good coalition because it's important for Europe. I mean, we are joking now, but it's really serious. The nature of the coalition that will be in place will have a major impact on what we will do for Europe in the next years.
Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, I want to thank you. I want to thank John Worth in Berlin. I want to thank as well Nadia Hirsch for joining us from Munich. Famke Krummüller. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Crean.
Hi, Francois. Lots of tweeting and reacting to what was going on at the Sorbonne today. Let's take a look at some of those reactions. First up, well, people waiting patiently. What do you do when you have 30 minutes to kill while you're waiting for a head of state to come along? I suppose you...
Instagram,
you tweet
Twitter.
an empty stage. That's what people were doing. Jean-Claude Juncker...
Yeah, why was he late?
Well, there were protests that might have had something to do with it. I'm not sure, though, because they probably cleared the way in. I don't have the answer to that. But anyway, Jean-Claude Juncker was tweeting as well. One can imagine he might have been watching closely from his offices, wherever he may have been in Brussels, I presume. A very European speech from my friend Emmanuel Macron. Europe needs courage. Thank you for the support and your work for the European institutions. Now, his head of cabinet was also tweeting. You can see that this was being closely watched by Eurocrats everywhere, I suppose. And in his office, Martin Selmayr was tweeting that Emmanuel Macron is right that a strong common currency is at the heart of a strong European Union. So some defence for the euro currency. Excellent, President Macron. This is a German MP of Turkish origin saying...
He's the co-chair of the Greens.
That's right. He says the future of our country resides in a united Europe. We need strong cooperation with Paris. So certainly the Franco-German alliance coming through there in quite a few comments. How to give a speech on Europe, whether you agree or not. Macron's speech from the Sorbonne has ideas and vision versus Florence speech. That's a reference to Theresa May.
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, there you go. I suppose what she's saying there is that the other speech was completely devoid of vision and ideas, which it probably wasn't. It's just not the same vision and ideas. In any case, what else do we have? Coming from a French president, this is courageous. Now, this is Emmanuel Macron's proposals to reform the common agricultural policy, which is seen as stacked in favour of, I suppose, French agriculture, for example. So some thumbs up for what is seen as a courageous remark there. And just quotes, a lot of people putting up quotes from that speech and the many different aspects of it. And this is the idea that a common intervention force, common budget, common doctrine to act should be in place within a decade. Now, he also spoke about creating European universities, 20 or so, all of this by 2024. He spoke about students speaking at least 2 European languages. So this is a really I suppose, federal European idea. Anyway, so lots of different reactions to that. Now, speaking of students and European universities, there were some who were not too happy, and that was also a feature of the day's events around the Sorbonne in the Latin Quarter. So just some criticisms now. People as being cynical as regards Macron's defence of the notion of European democracy, saying in the past referenda have been rejected when people have been expressing their democratic point of view. That's a frequent criticism of the European project.
Yeah, he specifically said during the speech that the ideas of referendums are bad because in a referendum you always vote no anyway.
Right, and that's a big debate. People will weigh in on both sides of that. The Europe that Brussels wants is only for the elites, multinationals and bankers. So these are comments that are coming through as well under hashtag Macron Europe and Macron the Sorbonne. You're getting both sides, Euro skeptics and Euro files and everything in between. This is the Telegraph UK saying that, well, actually a completely reformed Europe with different speeds. This is something that could actually have space for Britain down the line, post-Brexit. So that's one to think about. And just one or two more, Francois, before we go. essentially, Macron is persuaded, it believes that Merkel will reply with no timidity,
boldness,
based on this boldness, and in fact that she's on the same page in several regards. One line to retain, just one line to retain. France is taking the indispensable risk of taking the initiative. That's from the Brussels correspondent of Le Monde. So that's actually what's going on here, according to her.
All right, James Creedon. So much to talk about in that speech. Many thanks to you. Many thanks to our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.